It was a cold, quiet night in Irving, Texas. A taxi slowly pulled into the empty parking lot of a hotel. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Inside the cab, two teenage sisters, Amina and Sarah Said, sat close together in the back seat. Their father, Yaser Said, was driving. From the outside, it looked like nothing unusual. A father driving his daughters somewhere on New Year's night. But inside that car, the air was heavy. The girls had run away from him just days earlier. They had told people they were afraid for their lives. And now, after being convinced to come back, they were trapped in the one place they had always feared the most, alone with him. There was no music playing, no small talk, just the hum of the engine and the sound of tires on the road. The girls knew something was wrong. Every turn of the wheel felt slow, deliberate. At 7:33 p.m., Sarah picked up her phone and dialed 911. Her voice was shaky, full of panic. "Help, my dad shot me. I'm dying. I'm dying." Loud gunshots exploded in the background, then silence. Minutes later, police arrived. The taxi was parked outside the hotel in a fire lane. The doors were unlocked. In the back seat, Amina and Sarah lay motionless. The driver's seat was empty. Yaser Said had vanished into the night. This was not a random act of violence. It was the final step in a long story of control, fear, and abuse. A story that had been building for years. And it would take more than a decade, one of the longest manhunts in America, and the persistence of investigators before Yaser Said was finally caught and brought to justice. This is the story of the Said household. Welcome to the crime series. Before we begin, do us a quick favor. Drop your location and the time you're watching this in the comments. We want to know where you're tuning in from, because these stories matter everywhere. Like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. Yaser Said was born in Sinai, Egypt, in 1957. Not much is publicly documented about his early childhood or family background in Egypt, but those who later encountered him in the United States described a man shaped by a rigid worldview, one heavily influenced by patriarchal values and traditional notions of obedience and control. In his mid-20s, Yaser immigrated to the United States, joining thousands of others in pursuit of what was popularly known as the American dream. But what he sought wasn't the ideal of liberty and opportunity shared by so many immigrants. Instead, Yaser brought with him a cultural framework in which his authority as a man and father remained unchallenged. He settled in Texas sometime in the early 1980s. It was there that his story took a controversial and fateful turn. In 1987, Yaser began a relationship with a girl named Patricia "Tissy" Owens, a 15-year-old American teenager from a small town near Dallas. Yaser was roughly 30 years old at the time. The age disparity raised concerns, and the relationship quickly drew scrutiny from those around Patricia. However, under Texas law at the time, marriage with parental consent was permissible for minors. Patricia's parents reportedly gave that consent, though whether it was due to pressure, persuasion, or misunderstanding remains unclear. Their marriage was legally recognized, but not without controversy. Questions lingered about whether Patricia had the maturity or autonomy to truly consent. For Yaser, however, the arrangement served multiple purposes. It not only allowed him to remain in the United States legally, but also gave him unchecked control over a young, impressionable bride. Many who later examined their marriage would say it was never about partnership. It was about possession. Shortly after their union, Patricia became pregnant. Over the next several years, the family grew, with Yaser and Patricia eventually having 3 children, 2 daughters, Amina and Sarah, and a son named Islam. Amina was born in March 1989, followed by Sarah in June 1990. Just a year apart, the 2 girls were inseparable from the beginning. From the outside, they resembled a typical, working-class family. They lived in suburban North Texas, first in Louisville, and later moved to other parts of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Yaser drove a taxi to support the family, and Patricia stayed at home, isolated from most social contact. But behind the closed doors of their home, a different reality was unfolding. Yaser, from the earliest years of their marriage, forbade Patricia from working, driving, or maintaining friendships. She had no access to finances and no autonomy in decision-making. Her movements were restricted. Any attempt at personal freedom was met with intimidation, often accompanied by verbal abuse or implied threats of violence. Over time, she became a shadow of herself, submissive, quiet, and emotionally dependent on a man who ruled the family through fear. Yaser's interpretation of his cultural and religious background was not one of balance or understanding. Instead, he enforced a rigid, authoritarian vision of family honor, one that placed obedience to the male head of household above all else. This worldview, deeply rooted in Yaser's identity, would come to define the lives of Amina and Sarah from the moment they were born. As the years passed, the Said family remained largely cut off from outside influence. Yaser did not allow his children to attend social events, go to parties, or participate in extracurricular activities unless under strict supervision. Their friends were vetted, and in many cases discouraged entirely. Even extended family members reported that visiting the Said home felt tense and uncomfortable, a place where smiles were forced and every word seemed rehearsed. Yaser's distrust of American culture was palpable. He often spoke negatively about Western ideals, especially regarding women and their independence. According to family testimony, he saw American values as a corrupting influence that endangered his daughter's purity and the family's honor. To Yaser, assimilation was not an option, it was a threat. His daughters would not be allowed to adopt the freedoms of their American peers. Instead, they were expected to uphold his values, even if they never chose them. From the outside, Amina and Sarah Said appeared to lead ordinary suburban lives. They attended school, completed homework, and participated in school photo days like other children their age. But beneath the surface, their childhood was far from ordinary. It was defined not by innocence and freedom, but by a daily undercurrent of anxiety, an atmosphere tightly controlled by the person who should have protected them most, their father, Yaser Abdel Said. The Said home in Lewisville, Texas, sat in a quiet neighborhood surrounded by modest houses and well-trimmed lawns. It was a setting that gave no indication of the emotional storm contained within its walls. While neighbors might have noticed how reserved the family was, or how little interaction the children had outside of school, there was nothing outwardly dramatic or visibly alarming. No loud arguments spilling into the street, no obvious calls for help. That silence, however, was the result of fear, not peace. Yaser's parenting style was not based on nurturing or support. It was based on control. From early childhood, Amina and Sarah lived under a set of expectations that were non-negotiable. Any sign of self-expression or independent thinking was seen as disobedience. The girls were told what to wear, who to speak to, and how to behave, especially around boys. Their lives were monitored closely, with Yaser making frequent unannounced visits to their schools or workplaces once they were old enough to take jobs. His presence loomed constantly, whether physically nearby or psychologically embedded in their every decision. There were early red flags, some of which reached the attention of law enforcement. In 1998, when Amina and Sarah both made disturbing disclosures, they accused their father of sexual abuse. Law enforcement and protective services were involved. However, within a short time, both girls recanted their statements. They had been pressured, by Yaser and possibly by others close to him, to withdraw their accusations. The case was closed with no charges filed. In hindsight, this was a critical turning point, an opportunity to protect the girls that was lost. The long-term effects of that episode would echo throughout their lives. It instilled a chilling message that speaking out might only make things worse, and that even when they did, no one could protect them. For the next decade, the abuse, now mostly psychological and physical in nature, would escalate unchecked. Yaser's interpretation of honor, deeply rooted in rigid cultural norms, reinforced his control. While he claimed to follow Islamic traditions, multiple Muslim advocacy groups have since emphasized that his actions were not representative of the faith. What Yaser enforced was not religion, it was domination, framed as morality. Amina was beaten for smiling at a male classmate. Sarah, quieter and more reserved, tried to avoid confrontation, but even she could not escape their father's wrath. The surveillance intensified as the girls approached adolescence. Yaser began secretly videotaping them, often following them to school or spying on them in public. He would review their text messages and emails, looking for signs of relationships or friendships he deemed unacceptable. He kept recordings, screenshots, and notes, all part of what he believed was necessary to preserve the family's honor. It was a paranoid obsession that masked itself as paternal care. Though their home life was suffocating, both girls were able to carve out brief pockets of normalcy at school. Amina was bright, assertive, and deeply intelligent. She excelled in science and English, joined the debate team, and spoke often of becoming a doctor. She had a strong personality and spoke her mind when given the opportunity. Sarah, by contrast, was gentle, empathetic, and soft-spoken. Her dream was to become a teacher, and she often volunteered to help younger students. The contrast in their personalities only highlighted their shared courage. They each coped with the same home environment in their own way, but both longed for the same thing: freedom. Despite their efforts to succeed, their academic lives were frequently disrupted. School attendance records show periodic absences that often coincided with family conflicts. Friends and classmates noticed that the girls would suddenly go quiet or appear withdrawn, especially after long weekends or school breaks. There were changes in demeanor, subtle but significant. Amina, usually outspoken, would become somber. Sarah would stop smiling. These weren't teenage mood swings. They were signs of emotional exhaustion. Yet even then, the signs were missed, or more accurately, dismissed. Teachers and counselors may have sensed something was wrong, but few acted decisively. In some cases, cultural assumptions played a role. What many interpreted as strict parenting or traditional values were in fact symptoms of a deeply abusive environment. The girls' voices were either silenced by fear or softened by the hope that things might eventually improve. One of the most haunting artifacts of this period is a letter Amina wrote to her teacher. In it, she described the abuse in stark, unambiguous terms. She detailed how Yaser threatened to kill her if she was ever seen with a boy. She wrote about being afraid to go home, and about her fear that one day her father would follow through on his threats. The line that resonated most was painfully prophetic. He will, without any drama or doubt, kill us. This wasn't metaphor, it wasn't hyperbole, it was a warning, and it went unheeded. Patricia, the girl's mother, was not blind to her husband's behavior, but her role in the family dynamic was complicated. Having married Yaser at a very young age, she had never known adult life outside his control. Over the years, she had become conditioned to his authority. At times, she expressed fear for her daughter's safety. At others, she defended Yaser or minimized his actions. Her inaction wasn't born out of apathy. It was the result of decades of coercion. Experts on domestic abuse point to Patricia's behavior as a textbook case of battered woman syndrome, where fear, manipulation, and dependence converge to form an invisible cage. She loved her daughters, but she was unable or unwilling to stand against their abuser until it was too late. What made the situation even more complex was the family's isolation. Yaser discouraged contact with extended family members, rarely attended community events, and avoided situations where scrutiny could arise. As Amina and Sarah Said entered their mid-teenage years, the divide between the world they lived in and the one they longed for became increasingly stark. By 2006, the Said family had settled into a routine in the suburban sprawl of Lewisville, Texas. Yaser continued to work as a taxi driver, while Amina and Sarah attended Lewisville High School. Outwardly, the family blended into the community. But behind that veneer was a home atmosphere growing more unstable by the day. Yaser's fear of losing control over his daughters intensified as they matured, physically, emotionally, and socially. He seemed increasingly agitated by what he saw as their assimilation into American culture. From his perspective, it wasn't just a cultural shift. It was an erosion of the authority he believed he was entitled to maintain. Yaser's obsession with control had reached new and invasive levels. He began installing surveillance devices and eavesdropping equipment in the home. He regularly went through the girls' text messages and emails and had been known to record phone conversations. It wasn't just supervision. It was a system of constant monitoring where privacy no longer existed and suspicion was treated as proof of wrongdoing. But Yaser didn't stop at home surveillance. He reportedly followed Amina and Sarah in his taxi, parking outside their school or work shifts, waiting to see who they interacted with. He documented their movements, sometimes videotaping them in public. His behavior, while unnerving to bystanders, rarely led to confrontation. After all, he was their father, and to the casual observer, perhaps just protective. Privately, the girls understood the danger better than anyone. For them, the fear wasn't theoretical. It was lived experience. Yaser had made it explicitly clear that any defiance, particularly when it came to interactions with boys, would be considered a dishonor to the family. His concept of honor was rigid and punitive, and it was this concept that collided most violently with Amina's desire for independence. Sometime during her junior year of high school, Amina began secretly dating a classmate named Joseph Moreno. By all accounts, the relationship was respectful, committed, and deeply affectionate. Joseph described Amina as the love of his life, and Amina, in turn, saw in him a future she could finally shape for herself. They made plans to go to college together and even talked about getting married one day. But Amina knew the risks. Their relationship had to remain hidden at all costs. Unfortunately, it did not remain secret for long. Yaser discovered emails and messages exchanged between the two. His reaction was immediate and terrifying. Amina confided in her boyfriend and trusted friends that her father had threatened to kill her. These weren't empty threats. She believed them entirely. "He said he would put a bullet through my head," she once told Joseph, "and then he would kill Sarah." Amina's fear became a constant. She began strategizing ways to escape, gathering important documents, hiding small amounts of money, and speaking more openly to friends about her plan to leave Texas. Sarah, too, became more vocal, though she remained more hesitant. While Amina's defiance was overly known, Sarah's resistance was marked by cautious planning and subtle detachment from her father's authority. Despite their efforts to resist in private, Yaser's behavior continued to spiral. Family members reported that he carried a firearm regularly, both in his taxi and at home. He would often place it within reach, even during casual meals or quiet evenings. Whether it was for protection or intimidation was unclear, but in the presence of his daughters, it sent a clear message. He was watching, and he was prepared to act. By late December 2007, the Said family household had reached a breaking point. The threats that once lingered as dark shadows in the corners of their lives had become fully formed fears, named and repeated aloud. Amina and Sarah were no longer speculating. They were certain, if they stayed, they would die. That's when Amina and Sarah, with the help of their mother Patricia Owens, made a bold decision. They left. The plan had been quietly forming for some time. The girls had reached out to trusted adults, including Ruth Trotter, a longtime family friend, and Joseph Moreno, Amina's boyfriend. Patricia had also been increasingly unsettled by her husband's behavior. While she had long lived under his thumb, the escalating threats and rising paranoia had shaken her. She knew the danger her daughters faced, and in a rare moment of resolve, she agreed to act. On that very day, on December 26, 2007, just a day after Christmas, Patricia packed their bags. They fled North Texas and drove several hours north to Tulsa, Oklahoma. They left behind nearly everything: clothes, furniture, documentation, but brought with them the one thing they could not live without: a sense of hope. In Tulsa, the girls were taken in by Ruth and her husband. Their new environment, though unfamiliar, brought a sense of peace they hadn't felt in years. They were enrolled in school under assumed names, their location kept secret from Yaser. The girls seemed lighter, freer, almost unrecognizable in their newfound safety. For the first time, they weren't looking over their shoulders. They weren't whispering or calculating every word. They laughed. They planned. And for a few days, they believed they had finally broken free. Amina, in particular, blossomed during those days in Tulsa. She spoke constantly with Joseph over the phone, mapping out their future. She wanted to attend college, perhaps study medicine. Sarah was equally optimistic. She dreamed of becoming a teacher, and she told Ruth that she had never felt more hopeful. The atmosphere in Tulsa was not one of hiding, but of rebuilding. It was their soft reset, and for a brief flickering moment, it felt like the nightmare was finally behind them. But even from a distance, Yaser's shadow reached them. Back in Texas, Yaser began calling Patricia repeatedly. According to accounts from multiple sources, he pleaded with her to come home. He apologized. He promised he would change. He insisted he missed his daughters and that the past had been misunderstood. He framed himself not as a threat, but as a misunderstood father, desperate to reunite with his family. These calls marked the beginning of a psychological campaign, one built on manipulation, guilt, and emotional dependency. Yaser's methods were not physical this time, but they were no less effective. Patricia had spent over 2 decades in a relationship built on dominance. The line between love and coercion had long been blurred. And now, in this vulnerable moment, she began to listen. Amina sensed it first. She noticed her mother becoming distant, more withdrawn. Patricia no longer spoke about permanent escape. She no longer mentioned divorce. Instead, she relayed Yaser's messages. "He says he's sorry," Patricia would say. "He just wants to talk. He misses you girls." To Amina, the shift was terrifying. She warned Ruth and Joseph that her mother was considering going back. "If we return, he'll kill us," she told them, her voice firm and unwavering. She had no doubt. But her mother, seemingly caught in the grip of Yaser's emotional pull, began preparing for the return. Patricia told Amina they were only going to visit a relative's grave and that they wouldn't be seeing Yaser. It was a lie meant to lure her back to Texas. Amina, though suspicious, agreed, only on the condition that she would not have to stay under the same roof as her father. She had survived this long by trusting her instincts, and her instincts told her not to let her guard down. They arrived back in Texas on December 30th, 2007. Amina refused to return to the family home. She stayed with her friend Eddie, who later testified that she was terrified and adamant that she would not sleep in the same house as Yaser. Sarah, however, went with Patricia to the family residence. Sarah was more hopeful that perhaps this time things might be different, or perhaps she simply wanted to support her mother in what seemed like an emotionally fractured moment. What happened next remains a point of sorrow and controversy. On December 31st, Yaser suggested they all go out to dinner for the new year. He described it as a family outing, a peace offering of sorts. One final attempt at reconciliation. Patricia, convinced that her husband's demeanor had changed, urged Amina to join them. "Just for one night," she told her daughter, "one dinner. Then we can leave again." Amina resisted. She didn't trust it. But eventually, under pressure, she agreed. Before we continue, if you've been following this story and want to see more real-life crime cases told in detail, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss the rest of this case and the many others we cover here. The first day of 2008 was supposed to mark a new beginning. Across Texas and the country, families welcomed the new year with celebration and anticipation. As the sun set on January 1st, 2008, the teenagers Sarah and Amina sat in the back of a taxi cab. Their father, Yaser Abdel Said, was behind the wheel. It wasn't his regular cab. He had borrowed it from his employer, raising speculation that he may have done so to avoid immediate recognition or connection to the company. He told those around him he was working a shift. He had picked the girls up earlier that afternoon under the pretense of taking them out to dinner. A gesture he presented as a family reconciliation. But there was no dinner, no restaurant, no conversation, only silence, tension, and the slow, deliberate drive that ended in an empty hotel parking lot in Irving, Texas. Around 7:30 p.m. on January 1st, 2008, Patricia received a phone call from Amina. Her voice was anxious, strained. "I don't want to go to dinner," she told her mother. "Something feels wrong." That would be the last time Patricia ever heard from her daughter. The events inside the cab unfolded in chilling fashion. At 7:33 p.m., a 911 call was placed from Sarah's cell phone. Her voice, breathless and terrified, cut through the silence on the emergency line. "Help! My dad shot me. I'm dying. I'm dying." Gunshots echoed in the background before the call abruptly ended. It lasted just over 50 seconds, but it contained the most damning evidence the case would ever yield. In that moment, Sarah named her killer. There was no ambiguity, no mistaken identity. She was conscious, coherent, and dying, and with the last ounce of strength she had, she made sure her father would not escape accountability. The police were immediately dispatched to the scene using location data from the cell phone ping. Less than 10 minutes after the call, officers arrived at the Omni Mandalay Hotel, where they found the taxi abandoned in a fire lane near the hotel's entrance. What they discovered inside would traumatize even seasoned investigators. Amina and Sarah Said lay slumped in the back seat, bloodied and motionless. Amina had sustained 2 gunshot wounds, one to the chest and another that suggested she had turned, as if trying to protect herself or her sister. Sarah had been shot 9 times, with wounds across her chest and abdomen. The positioning of the bodies, the lack of defensive wounds, and the nature of the injuries led investigators to conclude that this was not a spur-of-the-moment act. It was planned, execution style. There were no signs of struggle, no weapons found near the victims. The scene was chilling in its silence. The lives of Amina and Sarah Said had been violently extinguished in a place where their final breaths were recorded by a desperate 911 call. Within hours of the discovery, a capital murder warrant was issued for Yaser Abdel Said, their father, and the prime suspect in their deaths. But as authorities scrambled to locate him, he had already vanished without a trace. In the initial hours following the murders, law enforcement launched an aggressive manhunt across Texas and beyond. Airports were notified, border agents alerted, and alerts were distributed through federal databases. It was feared Yaser might flee the country, possibly to Egypt, where he retained strong familial and cultural ties. But investigators were also aware of another possibility, that he could remain close, shielded by those who had long enabled his behavior. The earliest hours of the search produced no credible leads. Yaser's cell phone was turned off, and he left behind no identification or financial records to track. Surveillance footage from the hotel yielded little insight. The vehicle he had used, borrowed from another driver, had been abandoned deliberately. His escape was not impulsive. It was structured. In interviews with investigators, Patricia Owens, the girl's mother, revealed that Yaser always carried cash. He distrusted banks and rarely used traceable accounts. In hindsight, it became clear that he had been preparing for the possibility of flight well before the murders. Patricia described how he had once spoken about disappearing if anything ever happened, hinting that escape had been part of his plan for years. As police expanded the search, suspicion quickly turned inward, toward Yaser's immediate family. It wasn't an unfounded theory. For decades, Yaser had maintained a tight-knit familial network that largely remained silent, even as concerns about abuse and control surfaced publicly. Investigators believed that some family members may have been aware of his intentions, or at the very least were now helping to conceal his whereabouts. Chief among those suspected were Yaser's son, Islam Said, and his brother, Yaser Said. Islam, who was 19 years old at the time of the murders, had long lived under his father's influence. When interviewed, Islam's statements were inconsistent. He claimed he hadn't seen his father since the night of the murders, but phone records later disputed this. By 2014, after 6 years of evasion, the FBI placed Yaser Abdel Said on its 10 most wanted fugitives list. A $100,000 reward was offered for any information leading to his arrest. The agency's decision to place him alongside the nation's most dangerous fugitives was a reflection not only of the brutality of the crime, but of the calculated manner in which he had evaded justice. Publicity surrounding the case began to increase. News outlets like CNN, Fox News, and NBC revisited the story, airing investigative specials and reenactments. Photos of Amina and Sarah, smiling, full of life, were shown alongside Yaser's mugshot and renderings of how he might look after years in hiding. Billboards were erected in multiple states, and America's Most Wanted aired multiple segments appealing to the public for tips. But the trail remained cold, at least on the surface. For more than 12 years, the case of Amina and Sarah Said remained suspended in painful limbo. Their father, Yaser Abdel Said, had vanished the same night he was accused of ending their lives, leaving behind a trail of grief, unanswered questions, and a mounting sense of frustration. With each passing year, hope for justice diminished. Leads dried up, tip lines rang hollow, and the manhunt grew colder. Even as the story was kept alive through media segments, reward posters, and repeated calls for public assistance. But in August 2020, everything changed. On the surface, it began with a tip, one of many the FBI had received over the years. Yet this time, the details were too precise to ignore. An unassuming home in the rural community of Justin, Texas, less than an hour outside of the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex. It was a small, quiet town, nestled between cattle pastures and residential cul-de-sacs. Hardly the kind of place one would expect to find a man on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. And yet, that's exactly where Yaser was. The lead wasn't luck. It was the product of long-term surveillance. By 2020, investigators had narrowed their focus to individuals within Yaser's immediate family. Over the years, they had documented patterns of movement, monitored communications, and observed the behavior of those believed to be aiding him. Attention had increasingly focused on Islam Said, Yaser's son, and Yaser Said, his brother. Both men had remained tight-lipped in interviews and had a history of evading questions about Yaser's whereabouts. The FBI suspected they were more than silent. They were complicit. Surveillance teams had been watching a particular property registered to Yaser Said. Agents noted unusual activity. Groceries delivered, but no one seen entering or exiting for days. Blackout curtains drawn tight. Trash bins moved irregularly. There were no registered utilities at the address under Yaser's name. But to agents trained in fugitive operations, it had all the hallmarks of a safe house. After gathering enough probable cause, federal agents moved swiftly. On the morning of August 26, 2020, the FBI's Dallas field office, working in coordination with the Joint Terrorism Task Force and local law enforcement, executed a search warrant on the property. The raid was swift and surgical. Agents surrounded the home, called for occupants to surrender, and entered with tactical precision. Inside, they discovered a makeshift room at the rear of the house, barricaded, sparsely furnished, and disconnected from the rest of the home's utilities. And in that room, lying low and expressionless, was Yaser Abdel Said. He was arrested without resistance. The fugitive who had eluded capture for more than a decade was finally in custody, just 35 miles from the scene of the murders. He had never fled the country. He hadn't assumed a new identity. He had simply lived in the shadows, shielded by those closest to him. A man the nation had hunted across continents had, in truth, been hiding in plain sight. Photographs taken during the arrest show Yaser as older and more disheveled than his last known images. His hair had thinned, his body had thickened, and the brashness captured in earlier photos had faded. But to those who had followed the case, there was no mistaking him. The dark eyes, the strong jawline, the imposing presence, he was unmistakably the man who had once terrorized his own daughters. News of the arrest spread rapidly. The FBI issued a press release, confirming that Yaser Abdel Said, wanted for the 2008 capital murders of his daughters, had been apprehended without incident. The announcement was met with a mix of relief and disbelief. For law enforcement, it was the resolution of one of the longest-running fugitive cases in recent memory. For the families of Amina and Sarah, it was a painful vindication. But the story did not end with Yaser's arrest. Almost immediately, Islam Said and Yaser Said were arrested and charged with conspiracy to harbor a fugitive, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to obstruct an official proceeding. Court documents would later reveal that the men had played direct roles in enabling Yaser's escape and concealment. They had transported him, provided supplies, and deliberately misled federal agents. In one intercepted conversation, Islam was recorded saying, "He's never going to prison, they're never going to catch him." That illusion had finally been broken. According to court affidavits, Yaser had moved between multiple hiding places over the years, each time relying on a network of supporters who either shared his worldview or simply remained loyal to him despite the charges. He had lived in attics, garages, and makeshift rooms. In some cases, he hadn't left the house for months at a time. Islam and Yaser had managed logistics, delivering food, managing supplies, and coordinating movements without alerting neighbors or law enforcement. The FBI later confirmed that it was precisely this inner circle protection that had made Yaser so difficult to capture. He never used the internet. He never applied for a job. He never used a bank account or a cell phone in his own name. He lived like a ghost, sustained by those willing to bend the law to protect him. In 2021, both Islam and Yaser Said were convicted in federal court. Islam was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Yaser received 12 years. The judge, in his ruling, noted that without their cooperation, Yaser would likely have been arrested much earlier. Their actions, he said, had not only delayed justice, they had prolonged the agony of the victim's family and undermined public trust in the system. Meanwhile, Yaser was transferred to Dallas County Jail, where he awaited trial for the capital murders of Amina and Sarah. The criminal justice process, slowed further by the COVID-19 pandemic, resumed in earnest in early 2021. Yaser was charged with capital murder in the deaths of both daughters. If convicted, he faced life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Given the gravity of the case and the attention it had garnered, the Dallas County District Attorney's Office opted not to pursue the death penalty, choosing instead to focus on a conviction that would guarantee Yaser would never walk free again. As pre-trial hearings commenced, the courtroom became the setting for a delicate balancing act between the emotional weight of a family tragedy and the sober, methodical procedures of criminal law. Yaser, now in his 60s, appeared noticeably older. Gray hair, slowed gait, and a withdrawn demeanor. But the charges he faced had not softened with age. The prosecution presented a compelling, deeply layered case. Drawing upon years of evidence, they detailed a long history of abuse, intimidation, and coercive control within the Said household. One particularly emotional testimony came from Joseph Morano, Amina's former boyfriend. He described the secrecy surrounding their relationship, the repeated threats Amina faced when her father learned of her communication with non-Muslim boys, and the desperate escape to Tulsa just days before the murder. Joseph recounted the moment Amina told him she feared returning to Texas would be a death sentence. Another key testimony was provided by Ruth Trotter, the family friend who had taken the girls in during their escape. Ruth described how both sisters appeared emotionally liberated while in Tulsa, laughing, making plans for college, and expressing hope for the future. But that hope dissolved the moment their mother, Patricia Owens, convinced them to return to Texas. The prosecution argued that Yaser's actions on January 1, 2008 were not a crime of passion, but one of premeditation. The decision to borrow a cab, the methodical pickup of both daughters, and the secluded location where the killings took place all pointed to deliberate planning. They emphasized that Yaser had not called for help, had not surrendered, and had instead disappeared, living as a fugitive for over a decade with the assistance of his own family. The defense strategy was, by contrast, limited. Yaser's legal team attempted to cast doubt on the credibility of the recordings and challenged the timeline of events. They suggested that the prosecution lacked direct physical evidence tying Yaser to the shootings, an argument the prosecution quickly dismantled by highlighting the unambiguous nature of Sarah's dying declaration and Yaser's own disappearance as indicative of guilt. The defense also attempted to portray Yaser as a misunderstood father, a man from a different culture who struggled to raise children in a country with opposing values. But that framing failed to gain traction. Prosecutors rebutted this narrative forcefully, pointing out that cultural context could never serve as justification for violence, especially not the murder of one's own children. Yaser himself declined to testify. During the trial, Patricia Owens took the stand. Her presence was striking. She had remained silent for years, speaking only occasionally to the media in the years following the murders. In court, she appeared somber and reserved. She confirmed that Yaser had long expressed disapproval of the girls' Western behavior, particularly their friendships with boys and participation in school events. She also admitted to having been manipulated into believing that returning to Texas with the girls might resolve tensions, an admission that drew quiet gasps from the gallery. Despite her cooperation with the prosecution, some critics viewed Patricia's past decisions as contributing to the girls' fate. But legally, she was not charged with any crimes. The focus remained squarely on Yaser. The trial lasted 2 weeks. In the closing arguments, prosecutors reminded the jury of Sarah's final words, recorded and preserved as an act of sheer courage amid mortal danger. They played the 911 call one final time, allowing jurors to hear the pain, fear, and clarity in her voice. "She named her killer," the lead prosecutor said, "and then she died. There's no greater evidence." On August 9, 2022, the jury returned a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts of capital murder. Yaser Abdel Said was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He showed no visible emotion as the sentence was read. There was no apology, no statement, no acknowledgement of guilt. But the conviction of Yaser Abdel Said for the capital murders of his daughters, Amina and Sarah Said, closed a long and agonizing chapter in Texas criminal history. But the impact of the case did not end with the courtroom verdict. In its wake, the tragedy sparked a national conversation, one that extended far beyond the boundaries of Irving or Dallas County. It forced American society, its institutions, communities, and lawmakers to confront difficult, often uncomfortable questions about honor-based violence, the limits of cultural tolerance, and the persistent failure to recognize abuse masked as tradition. The murder of Amina and Sarah Said was not just a personal or familial tragedy. It became a watershed moment in how American society understands, confronts, and legislates against honor-based violence and domestic abuse, cloaked in cultural justifications. With the conviction of Yaser Abdel Said, the father who evaded justice for over 12 years, the legal arc of the case came to a close. If you believe stories like this need to be told, please subscribe, like this video, and share it with others. The more people hear these voices, the harder they are to ignore.